session of our symposium commences now. For our next resource speaker, we are welcoming back Dr. Augusto Vidaviana, as he was with us in our previous episode. Professor Augusto V. Daviana acquired his doctorate degree in history in the University of Santo Tomas, where he also took his degree in Bachelor of Arts in Asian Studies and Master's in History. Before joining the academe full-time, Dr. Daviana was the chief of the Research, Publication, and Heraldry Division of the National Historical Institute. He was also the former chairperson of the Department of History of the University of Santo Tomas. His research interests include wide range of topics in Philippine history, Japanese history, World War II, Philippine-Japanese relations, Micronesian history, history of the Malay world, oral history, and documentary research. Dr. Deviana has written at least 6 books on Philippine history, World War II, and the history of the Marianas, among which was Apples and Ampalaya, bittersweet glimpses of the American period in the Philippines. Collaborator, the issue of the political collaboration in the Philippines during World War II. He has authored a textbook for the Rizal course. As a co-author, Dr. Daviana wrote 6 textbooks for Araling Panlipunan. He authored more than 30 articles on history, which appeared in the Sahara Journal of the University of Malaya, the History Journal of the Charles Sturt University, New South Wales, Australia, and the Jurnal Kaijan Wilaya of the Indonesian Academy of Sciences, in addition to local journals like the Unitas and Filipiniana Sapa of the University of Santo Tomas. Once again, for his presentation on the Mount Samat National Shrine, here is Dr. Augusto V. Daviana.
Good afternoon. I take this pleasure to discuss Mount Samat, the Mount Samat Shrine, and the Battle of Bataan, and its historical significance. So Mount Samat is a mountain in the province of Bataan. So we have to talk about geography. Mount Samat is what is described by geologists as a parasitic cone of Mount Maribeles. Mount Maribeles is a larger volcano. By the way, Mount Samat itself was a volcano, and it has not erupted since 40,000 years ago. So along with the Mount Maribeles to the south, so when I say a parasitic cone, it draws its lava, its power, from a bigger source like Mount Maribeles. So you can see there to the south, Mount Maribeles to the south, and Mount Samat to the north. That small speck there is Mount Samat, but the bigger mountain there is Mount Maribeles. You can even see Mount Maribeles from Manila. And of course, another big volcano here is Mount Natib, which is very near Morong, Bataan, where the nuclear power plant is located. So the Mount Natib is actually an inactive volcano, and it's actually some considered as extinct, but still inactive, and it has not erupted for the last 50,000 years. We talk about Mount Maribeles. Mount Maribeles is a stratovolcano, meaning a massive volcano like Mount Mayon, and it has not erupted for the last 40,000 years. Okay, so along with the province of Cavite, we talk about the province of Bataan. Bataan serves as a lookout for Manila and its bay. So military planners saw its importance in drafting war plans. And of course, the most important part of the Philippines is Manila. And because it is the economic capital, also the political capital of the Philippines. And therefore, it had to be protected. And the province of Cavite to the south, south of Manila, and the province of Bataan to the northwest, serves as lookout for Manila and its bay. And of course, the United States already thought forward and had other war plans. For example, we had War Plan Black, which is a war plan just in case there's a war with Germany. War Plan Green, and for the war, possible intervention in Mexico. And War Plan Tan for intervention in Cuba. War Plan Red, just in case if the United States had a war with Great Britain or the United Kingdom and its dominions. War Plan Indigo calls for the occupation of Iceland. This actually happened during World War II when the United States occupied Greenland to replace the British. And of course, the strategic importance of Iceland is it might fall to Germany if left unguarded. We had War Plan Gold in case of a war with France and its colonies. War Plan Purple, war with the South American country. It didn't specify which country. War Plan Violet, again similar to War Plan Purple, a war with the Latin American country. War Plan Yellow, a war between the United States and China. There's also War Plan White. Again, just in case there's an insurrection within the United States itself. And War Plan Blue are defensive plans in case of defensive plans in times of peace. Now, the Philippines had a war plan just in case another insurrection will break out. So there's a War Plan Brown. So that is how the United States trusts us. So just in case somebody among the Filipinos would launch a war against the United States, that's War Plan Brown. And also you have the Rainbow Plan. Before I go that way, I'd like to discuss War Plan Orange, war with Japan. Okay, so I'll go then to the other colors. War Plan Rainbow. So there are sub-plans called Rainbow 1, Rainbow 2, Rainbow 3, Rainbow 4, Rainbow 5. War Plan Rainbow Plan 1 calls for a defensive war to defend the United States and the Western Hemisphere north of 10 degrees south latitude, meaning 10 degrees south of the equator, assuming that the United States had no allies. It also calls for the defense of the Panama Canal. Rainbow 2 calls for the defense of the Western Hemisphere, but with the help or having the United Kingdom and France as allies. Rainbow 3 is a repetition of Orange Plan, meaning war with Japan, on the provision that the hemisphere defense, meaning the Western Hemisphere, should be secured first, as provided with Rainbow Plan number 1. And of course, we have Rainbow Plan number 4. Same assumptions as Rainbow 1, but it extended the American mission that included the defense of the entire Western Hemisphere, not just 10 degrees north of the south latitude. So 10 degrees north of the south of the equator. Okay. And of course, we have Rainbow 5, where the United States will have an alliance with the United Kingdom and France and providing for offensive operations in Europe and Africa. So, where would the war plan with the Philippines fall into place, considering the invasion of Japan of the Philippines? It will be a combination of the war plan Orange and war plan Rainbow 5, but this time extending to Asia. Okay. So on December 8, 1941, Japanese attacks happened. So Manila was attacked, and that would be December 7, 1941, east of the international date line. So The war plan called for the withdrawal of U.S. forces to Bataan and wait for reinforcements coming from the United States. Um, so it became operational when the first bombs fell on the Philippines. But the plan is fatally flawed. Again, I'm speaking from hindsight. And again, I would like to emphasize the importance of knowing your geography. You can see here that Bataan is hemmed in. To the east would be Manila Bay. To the west would be the West Philippine Sea. And to the south would be the north and south channel of Manila Bay. So the opening of Manila Bay, we have the north channel, which is narrow. And forming the divide would be the island of Corregidor. And we have the south channel, which is wider than the north channel. So that would be Corregidor and the mainland at Cavite. So again, if you are a member of the USAFE or the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, you practically hem yourself in a cul-de-sac, meaning you put yourself in a peninsula and there's no means of escape because you cannot escape through to the sea, go to Manila Bay or go to the West Philippine Sea. Or the enemy can just come in, occupy Cavite, occupy Zambales, and therefore you are surrounded. Ayan. So the Filipino and U.S. forces cannot expect relief from the United States as the United States was damaged at Pearl Harbor. So at least 8 battleships are now resting at the bottom of the harbor. And of course, from California, it is very hard to have ships there because the Japanese control the sea lanes in the Pacific. So whatever MacArthur said that aid was coming, a mile-long convoy of ships would be coming, that's just propaganda. It didn't happen. And of course, we have the plan that the United States should defeat Germany first. I'm going to discuss that later. Now I'm going to speak from hindsight. What MacArthur should have done? MacArthur should have considered withdrawing east of Manila to the Sierra Madre. You know, east of Manila, there are hills which are also quite forested. And he should have withdrew at least east of Manila. Or another plan is to withdraw northwards towards the Cordillera and the Caraballo Mountains to the north. Again, the Cordillera. Remember that Antonio Luna, during the Filipino-American War, planned to withdraw to the Cordillera and use the mountains as his last stand and allow the Americans to be bogged down in the fighting until they will get tired and public opinion will run against the American military. Again, they could have evacuated to the Caraballo Mountains, it would be the Caraballo Mountains, or the Sierra Madre. Because even the Japanese themselves, like General Yamashita, back in 1945, withdrew to the Cordillera. And that served as his redoubt or his fortress until Japan surrendered. And he would have lasted long. The USAFE would have fought as guerrillas if they withdrew to the mountains. And of course, they would have avoided the death march. Okay. Next. And by December 21, 22, the Japanese were landing north and south of Manila. So the ones landing at the north, we have troops landing in Tugigaraw, landing at Bigan, and later some of them landed in Lingayen Gulf. That would be the northern force. And with the northern force came General Masaharu Homa, who was the head of the Japanese Expeditionary Forces. And to the south, the Japanese force coming from Palau landed in Legazpi, and another group landed in Lamon Bay. And from the landing points, they began to move towards Manila. So by January 2, 1942, the USAFE blew the Japanese were entering Manila. And before that, the USAFE, the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, began blowing up bridges as they retreated towards Bataan. The Japanese, who were simply mobile, simply crossed the rivers using the destroyed structures because, again, the Japanese were bicycle born. They're riding bicycles, and it was easy for them to cross bridges even if they were blown up. Ayun. And if they were blown up, it would be easy to find other ways to cross the river. Okay? There was resistance from the Filipino-American units as they retreated to Bataan. In Rosario, La Union, a battle took place between the Philippine Scouts, the 26th Cavalry, and the Japanese force on December 23, 1941. We have also the 11th Division of the Philippine Army and the 71st Division of the Philippine Army. They tried to stop the Japanese at the beaches, but because they were so spread out, and therefore the Japanese simply passed through. The 16th Division in the south fought the Japanese at Lamon Bay. And again, same story. The Japanese were able to pass through the defenses. So all the Filipino forces, Filipino-American forces, were not able to offer serious resistance. Okay? And of course, another thing worth mentioning is a tank battle which happened in Dinalupihan Maribeles Road, consisting of the 48th Division, 11th Cavalry, and the 11th Infantry in the 21st Division. And the Filipino-American forces suffered 50% casualty. And as the USAFE retreated into Bataan, they took with them supplies that they can carry. Okay, you must also remember that on December 8th, the same day as first Japanese attacks, many young men were called to service, so those who were trained, and they met in the University of Santo Tomas. And those who were around 17 years old and above were taken in. But according to one guerrilla, Colonel Emmanuel de Ocampo, he and his classmates were told to step down from the truck because they think that they were still very young and they should not be sacrificed in Bataan. The one that were recruited in UST went to Bataan. Okay. And we have the battle at Layak. The Layak Junction marked the beginning of the Battle of Bataan. This is the junction, two roads, one going to Olongapo, another road going into Bataan, in the town of Dinalupihan. So an engagement took place there, and the defenders managed to stop the Japanese. And the Japanese were employing tanks, and while the Filipino-American soldiers, most of them were dismounted. There were also tanks, but they were outmaneuvered by the more numerous Japanese tanks. Okay, so during the Bataan campaign, the defenders should have taken advantage of the mountainous spine of the province, which serve as good defensive positions. You can see here the lines, the defensive lines. So you have the Abukay Bagak line again, but you can see a gap. Merong diyang gap. You can see here because it is very mountainous. It is hard to defend, but also it's also hard to penetrate by an invading force. But unfortunately, they left that open. That would be a flaw in the defense later in the defense of Bataan. Okay. Of course, even so, we have the war plan at the time. The defenders should have taken advantage of the terrain by digging tunnels and digging foxholes and other defensive structures. Okay, so the defenders made one significant counterattack. So from their lines, they tried to push back the Japanese. Drove back the Japanese to Dinalupihan on January 16, 1942. But later, this was the troops of General Kapinpin. But later, they withdrew back to their original lines, to the Pilar-Bagak line. Okay. Since then, the USAFE forces were battled up in Bataan. Imagine, this is what I'm talking about. Peninsula of Bataan, hemmed in by Manila Bay, and also the West Philippine Sea. And the Japanese were coming from Zambales. Some of them were, when they have taken over Cavite, they're now within artillery range of Bataan. And of course, the defenders were subjected to daily artillery barrages and air attacks. So the Japanese, numbering a maximum of 65,000 men, were actually numerically inferior. Again, I'm talking about 65,000 men at the time when Bataan surrendered. But actually, the force actually dwindled to around a brigade. When I talk about a brigade, that would be, if I'm accurate, that would be around 2 regiments. So actually, there are very few. The Japanese were actually very few, 2 regiments, and so 2 regiments. Conservatively speaking, that would be around 1,200 men per regiment, and of course we can increase that to around 2,000 men per regiment, around 4,000 for 4,000. At most we have 10,000 men compared to a large force of around 76,000 men in the USAFE. But newspaper accounts said it was only 39,000. But actually, it's more than that. It's around 72 to 76,000 men under the USAFE. So General Homa was actually given only 56 days to conquer the USAFE, to not just the USAFE, but to take over the Philippines. But the campaign lasted for 4 months. So it may have seemed an embarrassment for General Homa, but actually, some of the force, the Japanese forces, they were pulled out to fight in other theaters in Southeast Asia, such as some of the force which fought in the Philippines were pulled out to fight in the Netherlands, East Indies. And the one who planned that was Count General Hisaichi Terauchi. And of course, it was intended that the Japanese campaign in the Philippines was only actually a secondary achievement, or secondary undertaking. The Japanese came here for 3 reasons. Again, to prevent the islands, the Philippines, from being used as a base to attack Japanese position. Number 2 is to prevent the Americans from cutting the Japanese lines. And the third would be to serve as a jump-off point to other areas in Southeast Asia. So therefore, when other historians were talking about, that they wanted the Philippines to supply natural resources, that is not even in the plan. Okay, and also there's things that are repeated several times, that if not for Bataan, Australia would have been conquered. Actually, that is not true, because the Japanese can easily leapfrog and bypass the Philippines and go all the way to Darwin, Australia. In fact, Darwin, Australia itself was attacked when the Philippines was still resisting the Japanese. Okay, so now we have demoralization within the USAFE. So the promised reinforcements from the United States never arrived. It is because of Franklin D. Roosevelt's promise to defeat Germany first, and that um, their relief force would not be forthcoming. Um, Roosevelt promised that there would be reinforcements once they hold up in Bataan. That will never come. Okay, because he and Winston Churchill made a commitment that they would defeat Germany first before defeating Japan. MacArthur, who was holed up in Corregidor, later left for Australia. Again, he left his men. Um, although MacArthur resisted direct orders to uh, escape to Australia at first, but later he relented and he escaped. I think in March 23, if I'm not mistaken, he left for Australia, and of course, for escaping the Philippines. Again, this is very debatable. What I'm going to say. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. Imagine, for running away from his men, he was given a Medal of Honor. Hindi ganyan. Um, um, Actually, officially, the medal was given to MacArthur for his defense of Bataan. Again, that's another flaw, because for the defense of Bataan, well, the Bataan actually fell. Okay. So again, now conditions at the front. There are around 12,000 plus Americans, around 75,000 plus Filipinos. There was discrimination among the ranks. Among the Americans would be some Filipinos, such as the Philippine Scouts. And Philippine Scouts are considered as part of the U.S. Army. They receive better pay, better rations, and better equipment. That's caused jealousy among the PA, meaning the Philippine Army. So, and among the Philippine Army, you also have people who are not actually soldiers. They were actually members of the constabulary. Remember that many of the constabulary was fused to the Philippine Army as a preparation for when the USAPE was created. So you have policemen and no military training, no training in artillery and heavy weapons, and they are now equal to the ordinary Filipino soldiers. Again, it was said that in terms of discipline, the constabulary men were rough, and they are also accused of corruption, although there's also corruption within the army itself. So there's a discrimination among themselves. So there was no unity among the defenders. By March, the rations were reduced to 1/4 of the normal supply. So, so if you used to receive, let's say, 1 ganta of rice, you now receive only 1/4. Soon, the stress, fatigue, and malnutrition began to affect the troops. So imagine yourself fighting continuously. You're bombarded almost daily by air attacks and artillery, no sleep, and that would take a heavy toll, more than bullets. Okay. The discovery of the body of dead woman near the battle site became a morale booster. It was said that the Japanese molested and killed her, and the woman was named Virginia. And the USAPE men swore to avenge her death. Although it was never proven that the Japanese did it, it was highly unlikely that they did it. It may be even the defenders. But again, that was silent. So, ayan. Also, the defenders received daily doses of propaganda. Some of it came from Filipinos, like Emilio Aguinaldo, who went on radio calling on the Filipino defenders to lay down their weapons. And and join the Japanese. And another would be an announcement from the Japanese radio that there's also a government composed of Filipinos serving under the Japanese. This would be the government of Jorge Vargas, Quintin Paredes, Jose P. Laurel, and many others. Many of them have now formed a government called the Executive Commission, and this would be the government under the Japanese. Quezon, who was holed up in Corregidor, received messages from the Japanese asking him to leave his dugout and abandon the Americans. But again, he would not. It is also possible that MacArthur had orders to arrest or even kill him if he decided to move over to the other side. So again, Quezon, you might say, was a hostage of the of MacArthur. But later, Quezon himself evacuated ahead of Quezon. And there's this story. There was this story on the radio. On the radio, Quezon was telling that he was willing to die with his own people. But behind the radio, he was negotiating with MacArthur that he and his family can be evacuated. But MacArthur said, the last submarine to leave Corregidor is already full. And so Quezon radioed his former executive secretary to prepare a check for $500,000 payable to MacArthur and money amounting to $140,000 payable to General Sutherland and the other aides of MacArthur. And the moment the check cleared at the at the bank in New York, suddenly, mysteriously, space appeared in the submarine. Space enough for President Quezon, his wife, his son, his daughters, including his the Chinese yaya of one of his children. Some people would say that Quezon bribed MacArthur so that there would be a space in the submarine. But Quezon, being a very smart politician and a lawyer, also, of course, he made it appear that the payment was made to MacArthur for his services rendered as advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth. And according to American law, it is a violation because the Philippine Commonwealth at that time is already considered as an alien government. And American officials, including the American military men, were prohibited by law from receiving any gift from a foreign government, much more compensation. President Roosevelt and Secretary of War Henry Stimson knew about it. They knew about the payment made to MacArthur, that $500,000 to MacArthur and the rest of the money to MacArthur's aides. And they kept silent about it. Okay, they kept silent. President Roosevelt even gave MacArthur a Medal of Honor. Ayan. So therefore, why did Roosevelt and Stimson remain silent? At that time, America needed a hero. And MacArthur, because of his speeches, his utterances on radio, and valiantly resisting the Japanese, he appeared to be a hero when actually he was hiding in the bowels of Corregidor. And the Americans called him dugout dog. Dugout dog. So, lagi siya nasa dugout. He's always hiding. And of course, MacArthur eventually fled Corregidor, leaving Wainwright and the rest of his men to face the Japanese. Okay, so, and of course, MacArthur, with his eloquence, upon arriving in Australia, told the Australian Parliament that these famous words that we came through and I shall return. So again, his famous I shall return speech. And he went on to become the commander of the American Southwest Pacific Forces. Never mind if he blundered in what happened to the first hours when the Japanese were attacking the Philippines, and he did nothing, allowed the Japanese to bomb the planes in Clark and other air bases, and there was no response. There was there was actually an 8-hour window before the first Japanese attacks, between Pearl Harbor and attacks in the Philippines. So nothing happened. Yet he is called the American Caesar by one American author. Okay. During the month of April, actually late in the month of March, more Japanese reinforcements arrived, and an offensive was planned in time for the emperor's birthday. So they call it Jimu Tenno Sai. So this would be supposed to be the birthday of the mythical Emperor Jimu Tenno, not Hirohito. Mali yung it's not Hirohito's birthday, but Emperor Jimu's birthday. And the Japanese pushed through. Oh, I like to also mention that the Japanese before that waged tried to encircle the USAFE by attacking from the rear. It's called the Battle of the Points and the Battle of the Pockets. So Battle of the Points, when the Japanese launched an amphibious attacks, Japanese forces coming from Zambales tried to land in the southern part in southern Bataan, and the attacking force was annihilated. The same for the pockets. So the Japanese tried to establish pockets, or what you call bulges, but again in the defense line. But again, these were eliminated by the combined Filipino-Japanese forces. Actually, the Japanese forces that were fighting, they were a large part of it is actually a garrison force. It's meant to be an occupation force, not the hardened veterans from China. Many of them came from Taiwan. They came from Japan, and they're actually a secondary force. Their job was to take over the Philippines and occupy it. There's only a small group of Japanese who are actually veterans from the other battlefields, meaning coming from China. Okay, so on the night of April 7, the Japanese penetrated the spine of Bataan. This is what I was talking to you about. Ayan, so in the defense line, there's a gap. So the Japanese managed to penetrate through this gap, and they passed through the defenses, and soon they were at Mount Samat. Okay. So they overran the 57th Infantry Regiment and the 31st Division, and they gained control of the spine of Bataan. And now they can have taken over Mount Samat from Mount Samat, which stands at 1,200, I think 1,000, more than 1,000 feet above sea level. And they can now rain down artillery on the USAPE troops below. And the surviving troops are ordered to evacuate to the south and move over to Corregidor. So if the defenders did not surrender, there would be a terrible slaughter. And U.S. General Ernest P. King began negotiation of the surrender forces under his command. And they met in a school in one of the towns in Bataan, and it was agreed that all forces should lay the USAFE forces would lay down their weapons on the night of the April 8, 1941, and start coming out of their defenses by April 9. So while he was in Australia, General MacArthur accused General King of cowardice. He was expecting that he and his men should die like defenders of the Alamo. You remember the Alamo, wherein the defenders, most of the defenders died defending the fortress. And MacArthur would also demand the same for General Wainwright, because he expected General Wainwright, who was then in Corregidor, to fight until the last man. While MacArthur was now living comfortably in the safety of Australia. Okay. And the USAPE, before they surrendered, they started blowing up what remained of their ammunition. They disabled their guns, and the explosions were heard as far south as Manila. And again, the explosions would belie the fact that there was lack of ammunition among the USAFE. In fact, they had adequate amounts of ammunition, but they already lacked food. And the greatest enemy of the defenders was fatigue. Imagine having no sleep for the last 3 months. So how can you survive that? And the Japanese expected further resistance. They actually expected that the defenders would last 1 month more at least. Okay, and they were so surprised that a lot of Filipinos and Americans surrendered. Some soldiers who refused to surrender decided to escape. Some fled by sea, and fishermen made a killing by ferrying escaping soldiers. They escaped to nearby Cavite or Manila. Others melted into the jungle, going into and many of them became guerrillas. Many soldiers donned civilian clothes, hid their weapons, and melted into the civilian population. Many weapons were left behind, and some were taken over by the nascent or soon to be already established Hukbalahap. According to Luis Tarok, when I talked to him when he was still alive, he said the USAPE were throwing away their weapons, and they were so happy to pick up the abandoned weapons. Okay, so those who remained in Bataan remained POWs, or prisoners of war of the Japanese. And as I said earlier, the mass surrender surprised the Japanese because they thought the USAPE will fight until the end, and they expected more Japanese units to join them. In fact, there was this Kawaguchi unit, which was on its way to Bataan. But on the way, they learned that Bataan already surrendered, so they went to Cebu, where the Kawaguchi unit captured Jose Abad Santos, who was left behind by Quezon, and maybe to organize the Philippine government in his absence. Jose Abad Santos, being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was the highest official left behind by Quezon, and the Japanese tried to make him cooperate. When he steadfastly refused, so the Japanese under Colonel Masanobu, as a Japanese colonel, ordered his execution. I remember that name, si Masanobu. Actually, he was never in the war. He was never made to answer for his war crimes. In fact, he was shielded uh, by the Americans themselves, and he was even used in the Vietnam War. But I'm going to talk about that in the open forum if that is raised. Okay. The Japanese were unprepared to the deal of thousands of prisoners. They actually had 200 trucks to ferry the prisoners to Camp O'Donnell. But since they are numerically inferior and they're surrounded by a potentially hostile civilian population, they had to march them under the hot April sun. Of course, the Japanese, again, this is not to defend the Japanese for what they did. The Japanese were cruel because first they expected the Yusafi men to fight until the end, and this violates their notion of Bushido. So surrender was worse than death. So they considered the Yusafi men as worse than animals. So to be treated as such. And of course, what happened was the wanton cruelty. And since many Japanese suffered casualties, especially in the hands of the well-trained Philippine scouts, the scouts were the ones getting the beating. So, they were more abused more. And of course, those who could not anymore walk were bayoneted or shot. And of course, there are actually less guards. Now, the less guards among the prisoners, and some prisoners could easily escape. And the Japanese made a warning. If you have your 10 prisoners and one of you disappeared, the rest will suffer. They will kill one person for every one escapee. Okay, but I'm talking about the death march, and that is another topic. Okay, so the Japanese netted 76,000 prisoners of war. And prisoners of war began the death march from 2 points, one from Maribeles, from the southern part of Bataan, another one from Bagak, from the western part. That's why you can go to the markers today. You can see two markers, both kilometer zero for the death march, one in Maribeles, the other one for Bagak. So again, during the Bataan campaign, Mount Samat was heavily bombarded. That's why it lost most of its vegetation. And again, the capture of its mountains allowed the Japanese to pinpoint the defenses of nearby Corregidor. And they fired from Bataan at Corregidor. Again, the Japanese also used another piece of technology. And Luis Tarok once mentioned that the Japanese were using helicopters. Actually, when I asked him again, Sir, pakiulit-ulit, can you repeat it that there were helicopters and they were used by the Japanese? Oh, may mga helicopter nga sila sabi sa akin. They told him. He told me. And I did some research, and I found out that they were not helicopters, they were gyrocopters. So part airplane, part helicopter. And they were purchased from the United States, originally purchased from the United States. And originally, actually, they were invented in Spain. And they're copied by the United States. And the Japanese made copies of the gyrocopters, or helicopters, you may call it, but actually gyrocopters. And they're used for reconnaissance. Okay? So fast forward, what happened to Mount Samat? In the latter part of the war, Bataan was liberated by U.S. forces. Again, they have to avenge their defeat in Bataan. At the same time, the strategic importance of Bataan, because it serves as one of the gateways towards Manila through Manila Bay. And of course, the Bataan campaign 1945 lasted from January 31, 1945 to February 21. So Filipino and U.S. forces consisting of the 34 RCT, so 34th Regimental Combat Group, the 157th Regiment, and 149th Infantry. And there were also seaborne landings conducted by the 38th Division. And they secured the western area of Manila Bay. So when the Americans and Filipinos reconquered Mount Samat, as well as other battle areas, they discovered the whited remains, the bones, the skeletons of the Filipinos, Americans, and some Japanese who fell in the Battle of Bataan, and the Japanese never bothered to bury them. Therefore, until today, there could be some remains that could be found in the Bataan area. Not to mention the unexploded ordnance. So it was said that they had to burn a large area of Bataan because there's a large risk of encountering unexploded ordnance. I'm talking about shells, bombs, and other ammunition that were still in the area. Okay, so presently, Mount Samat is considered to be an important World War II site. And a memorial consisting of a giant cross was erected there. And this cross measures 312 feet. The mountain itself is 1,821 feet above sea level, or 555 meters above sea level. So that's the actual height of the mountain. And you added 300 feet more because of the cross. And again, it's the tallest structure in Bataan. And the arms of the cross measured 98 feet, or almost 30 meters. So you can climb up the cross using an elevator. So, yan. And if you reach the arm of the cross, there are windows where you can view the surrounding areas. You can even see Manila from the arms of the cross. Okay, so this is the gallery. This is the gallery of the arm of the cross. Again, it's about 30 meters for each arm, so total of 60 meters. Okay, so the description of the shrine. There's a parking lot, and there's a series of steps that narrows to a top lead to the flagpole, which holds the flag of the Philippines. And the last steps to the colonnade are bordered on two sides by two pedestals topped by two urns, symbolizing eternal flame. Ito po yung nasa ano. Although there's no flame, but again, it's just a symbolism. Okay, so the colonnade is marble clad and surrounded by an esplanade, surrounded by marble clad parapets. And the outer side has 19 high relief sculptures by national artist Napoleon Abueva. You may notice that it shows not only the veterans of Bataan, but even Lapu-Lapu, Andres Bonifacio. So all those who fought in the Philippine Revolution and the Philippine-American War are represented in the reliefs made by national artist Napoleon Abueva. And there's also the bronze insignia of the USAPE division units. It was rendered by the Talleres de Maximo Vicente and Valdez and Sons. Valdez and Sampra and Sons. Each bronze insignia has a flag strap and the flags of each division. Okay, so I forgot to mention that two Filipino generals were also present in the Battle of Bataan. This will be General Capinpin, General Vicente Lim, and also General Fidel Segundo. And also General Guillermo Francisco, if I mentioned him, General Capinpin, and the other high officials were well treated by the Japanese compared to the ordinary soldiers. And General Guillermo Francisco later became head of the Japanese era Philippine Constabulary or Bureau Constabulary, while General Kapinpin became a military advisor. It's quite strange when the Americans returned. General Kapinpin was freed. Pinakawalan siya. He was freed by the Americans. While General Francisco was jailed because according to him, he was a collaborator. So again, they didn't make distinction when they are both collaborators. And why is it that the treatment was unequal? And that remained a controversy after the war. Now, let's talk about the colonnade. The center of colonnade, you have an altar. Again, this is the altar. And there are three religious stained glass murals designed by Sinon Rivera and executed by Bertrate d'Arte Giuliani of Italy. Okay? And there are 4 bronze chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. And while inscribed in marble were the narrative of the Battle of Bataan. So the story of the Battle of Bataan can be read from the narrative. Okay? And also there's a footpath leading to the base of the memorial cross. And the footpath is paved with bloodstones. These are the stones that you can find in Corregidor. They're bloodstones because they're colored red, not because of the blood of those who died there, because that's part of that's a natural occurrence. So the stones are colored red. Okay, and there's if you cannot climb the 14 flight zigzag path to the base of the cross, there's a road that could take you there. Okay, ayan. So the colonnade, and after that you have the pathway leading to the cross. And the cross, I wondered before why the path was very rough. It's paved with stones. So I learned only yesterday that the stones there came from Corregidor, and they are bloodstones. Yeah. So the summit of Mount Bataan, now the Mount Summit National Shrine, is now under the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office of the Department of National Defense. It was inaugurated in time for the 20th anniversary of the Battle of Bataan. So it took quite a long time for it to be completed because it was declared by President Marcos back in 1966, but because of lack of funds, it was completed years after. So it had to wait for 25 years for the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Bataan. And also, not only Filipino veterans were invited to come back, but even the Japanese. It's what President Marcos called the reunion for peace. So Filipinos, Americans, and Japanese were to come back, not to renew and open up old wounds, but also to remember the comrades who died in the battle, whether Japanese, American, or Filipino. Okay, so again, this is the colonnade, and you can see there the inscriptions of the Battle of Bataan. Okay, so the shrine has a museum. It's an underground museum, and you can see there a relief map of the Battle of Bataan. Also some pictures of the Death March. So it's quite hard not to talk about the Death March because the aftermath of the Battle of Bataan is the Death March. Okay, so now school children should visit the site as well as other World War II sites so that they will feel what what their grandfathers did in the name of freedom, defending the country against invaders. And so nowadays, events of World War II are being forgotten. And it's quite saddening that the big players are always the Americans when the Filipinos bore the brunt of the fighting. Including the Battle of Bataan, as well as the battle for the Philippines, and the so-called liberation of the Philippines. I will not even call it liberation of the Philippines, because liberate from what? Well, we were already free, actually, even during Japanese time, when the Japanese recognized our independence. And it's not a puppet republic, I would tell you, because President Laurel himself resisted the Japanese at the risk of having himself killed. So it's not a puppet republic, as I said in my last lecture. Okay, so this ends my report. Thank you very much for listening.
Dr. Daviana.
Before we proceed to our last speaker for today, let us take a virtual tour at the dwelling place of the world's second largest memorial cross, the Mount Samat National Shrine. Let's watch.
Ang dambana ng Kagitingan ay matatagpuan sa tuktok na bahagi ng Mount Samat sa bayan ng Pilar, probinsya ng Bataan. Pero bakit nga ba sa Mount Samat? Nang bumagsak ang hukbong Filipino-Amerikano sa kalakhang bahagi ng Luzon noong ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig, nagtipon-tipon ang mga sundalong Pilipino at Amerikano sa Bataan upang buong tapang nilumaban sa mga sundalong Hapon. At nang tuluyang bumagsak ang korehidor noong ika-6 ng Mayo taong 1942, ang Mount Samat ang nagsilbing kanilang huling tanggulan. Itinayo ang dambana noong taong 1967 bilang parte ng ika-25 taong paggunita sa nakalipas na digmaan. Ang dambanang ito ay tinayo upang magbigay parangal at magsilbing tanda sa mga Pilipino at Amerikanong buong pusong nakipagdigma laban sa mga Hapon. Ano nga ba ang makikita sa loob ng Mount Samat? Ang higanteng krus na matatagpuan sa Mount Samat ang pinakatampok sa lugar na ito. Ang krus ay nakatayo sa taas na 555 metro above sea level at may taas itong 72 metro at 30 metro sa kada kamay ng krus. Sinisimbolo nito ang 72 araw na pakikipagdigma ng sandatahang Pilipino-Amerikano kontra Hapon. Ang ibabang bahagi ng krus ay disenyong gawa ng national artist for sculpture na si Napoleon Abueva na nagpapakita ng pagiging magiting na bayani ni Gat Jose Rizal, Antonio Luna at Lapu-Lapu. Tampok rin sa higanteng krus ang view deck nito na matatagpuan sa mga kamay nito. Dito ay masisilayan ang mga magagandang tanawin gaya ng Manila Bay at ng kalakhang probinsya ng Bataan. Ang colonnade naman ay isang pambihirang istrukturang gawa sa marmol. Matatagpuan sa gitnang bahagi nito ang altar na may stained glass mural na disenyo ni Seno Rivera. Sa harap na bahagi nito, matatagpuan ang matayog na watawat ng Pilipinas. Nakaukit naman sa mga dingding ng colonnade ang kasaysayan ng nakalipas sa digmaan, habang ang gilid ng colonnade ay may disenyong mula kay Abueva na gawa sa nililok na marmol. Ipinapakita nito ang mga pangyayari sa nasabing digmaan. Mayroon ding matatagpo ang museo sa colonnade kung saan makikita ang mga sandatang ginamit ng mga Pilipino-Amerikano at ng mga Hapon. Ang nasabing museo ang nagsisilbing lundayan ng mga totoong kaganapan at impormasyon ukol sa lumipas sa digmaan. Ano ang kahalagahan ng dambana ng Kagitingan? Bagamat sinasariwa nito ang paghihirap na dinanas ng mga sundalong Pilipino-Amerikano sa kamay ng mga Hapon, ang dambana ng Kagitingan ay isang natatanging lugar sa Pilipinas na nagpapakita at tumaalala sa kagitingang ipinakita ng mga veteranong Pilipino at Amerikanong sundalo. Ito ay ang magpapaalala sa at sa mga susunod pang henerasyon kung gaano kagiting ang liping Pilipino.
For our last speaker for today, we have the NHTP Executive Director, Mr. Restituto L. Aguilar. Mr. Restituto L. Aguilar is presently the Executive Director of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, or NHTP. Prior to his current position, he was the Chief of the Veterans Memorial and Historical Division, Philippine Veterans Affairs Office for 6 years. Director Aguilar is a member of the Philippine Military Academy class of 1978, Makatarungan, and has retired with the rank of Brigadier General in the Armed Forces of the Philippines after 33 years of military service. Aside from his command and staff postings during his military service, he was sought out as consultant in the research of the history of the various military camps and museums in the country. He also contributed to the establishment of the Armed Forces of the Philippine Museum in Camp Aguinaldo. Director Aguilar also published various articles about the history of different AFP units in various academic publications and was the editor-in-chief of the Cavalier, the official publication of the Philippine Military Academy Alumni Association Incorporated, from 2002 to 2012. He also authored the Philippine Military Academy Register, a product of over 17 years of diligent research about the individual military histories of over 17,000 men and women who have entered the Philippine Military Academy. Once again, let us all welcome Mr. Restituto L. Aguilar.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am tasked to provide you with a story of the life of the veterans in the aftermath of the Second World War. The sequence of my presentation is as shown. In the history of the Pacific, during the Second World War, no country has resisted an invasion or an occupation force as intense and as widespread as in the Philippines. In some countries, they have just waited for the Allied liberation forces to return and freedom from enemy control. Since the end of the war, hundreds, if not thousands of books have already been written on this instant topic, and still many are yet to come as records and documents continue to surface from previously obscure storage bin or diaries of some forgotten soldiers. Our military schools and even some in the academy have spent long hours of discussions on this segment of our history, but still it keeps coming. In preparation for the promised independence of the Philippines, a 10-year transition was granted by the U.S. Congress to prepare the country for self-governance, with the establishment of the Commonwealth government headed by President Manuel L. Quezon. First to be enacted was Commonwealth Act No. 1, otherwise known as the National Defense Act. In order to carry out the defense preparations, the country was divided into 10 military districts, where various training centers were to be established in the event of war. The military districts shall be mobilized into reserve infantry divisions, with the officers and conscripts forming the backbone of the said units, to fight the invaders, backed up by volunteers. The turn of events went so fast, and it was thought that the war came too soon. While the Japanese have already invaded China as early as 1937, it was hoped that they would not attack until about late 1942. Even the Americans did not anticipate that their might will be challenged by a still emerging power like Japan. While the conclusion of the conventional war was relatively short for all other neighboring countries, it took the Japanese 4 months before the Filipino and American forces would lay down their arms, but this substantively upset the Japanese timetable, as Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa was only given 55 days to conclude the Philippine operations. While the fighting in Bataan and Corregidor was still raging, many of the units originally ordered to proceed to Bataan for an organized defense were trapped and were in danger of getting routed. They have been disbanded and converted into irregular forces or guerrilla units. This included the Hunters ROTC guerrillas from the disbanded PMA classes of 1944 and 1945, who convinced their ROTC classmates to organize a distinct guerrilla unit to open up a second front and in the process help the conventional forces fight the Japanese. The same situation happened also throughout the width and breadth of the island from Batanes to Tawi-Tawi. The Koga Papers. An intelligence windfall came at the most unexpected time and place, and this essentially altered the outcome of the war in the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy top brass were on board two Kawanishi HSK-2 Emily seaplanes that crashed in the Sea of Cebu. One of the planes carried Admiral Miniechi Koga, the successor of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, whose plane was shot down by American fighter aircraft on 18 April of 1943. Koga was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese combined fleet at the time of the crash. The other plane carried top officers to include the second in command, Rear Admiral Shigeru Okudume, and other staff officers. The top Japanese naval officers were captured by the Cebu guerrillas, but what was vital in the war effort was the recovery of a box of blackened oil off Barangay Perilos, Caracara, Cebu. It contained documents drafted by Admiral Koga on 23 August of 1943, and it was called the Z or Show Plan that was approved by the Japanese High Command and was adopted on 8 March of 1944 as the Combined Fleet Secret Operations Order Number 73. The plan anticipated that Allied forces would leapfrog to Mindanao first. A massive operation was conducted by the Japanese troops, killing civilians in order to pressure the guerrillas into turning over the prisoners and the documents. The Japanese officers were released, but the guerrillas denied knowledge on the Koga Papers. The documents were sent to Southwest Pacific Area headquarters of General MacArthur in Brisbane, Australia, for translation and evaluation, and it was found to be a gold mine. The capture of the Koga Papers was the crowning achievement of guerrillas in Cebu and the Philippines. It contained vital information of air and naval bases throughout the Pacific and the number of air and naval assets of the Japanese forces. As the Americans first concentrated their forces in defeating the Axis forces in North Africa, then in Europe, they focused their war effort next on the defeat of the Japanese forces in the Pacific theater of operations. With the show plan in their hands, the Allied forces knew how their enemy would employ their warship and aircraft against the Allies. They knew where to concentrate their forces with the least Japanese resistance, thus Leyte, Mindoro, and then Lingayen. The Allied liberation campaign would not at all be successful without the assistance of the resistance of irregular forces, who were trained in the art of fighting by engaging the Japanese first in hit-and-run tactics, quickly learning the enemy tactics, techniques, and procedures. They were bolder in confronting the occupation forces by the time the Americans returned. After the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito announced the unconditional surrender of Japan on 15 August 1945. The Japanese forces in the Philippines, however, may not have immediately learned and remained defiant and made their last stand in northern Luzon. The USFNL continued their operations with the support of American divisions and eventually pressured Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita into surrendering on 2 September 1945 at Kiangan, Ifugao. He was brought to Camp Janhei for formal signing of the instrument of surrender on 3 September 1945. The Japanese forces were also sent to Baguio on foot before being dispatched to POW camps in the country and other parts of the Pacific. War crimes. As Japanese prisoners were being brought to POW camps, the loss of life and properties and reports of atrocities were astounding that cannot be simply swept under the rug. There were about 1 million Filipinos killed during the war, out of a total population of 18 million. Justice must be served at all costs, and the Japanese officers and soldiers with recorded cases of brutalities and barbarism were subjected to trial in the Philippines, and many of them were found guilty and sentenced to death or life imprisonment. There were others, however, that luckily evaded the trials. Also, Filipino collaborators were tried and convicted. Unfortunately, there were those who were pardoned by Presidents Rojas and Quirino, who have not fully held accountable of their inhumanity to Filipino people. As the bulk of the Japanese troops were already in POW camps, others continued to resist. Mopping up operations were conducted to neutralize Japanese stragglers who may not have learned of the end of the war or were simply fanatical and swore to die for their emperor at all costs. The tactical actions were conducted by the troops of the reconstituted Philippine Army. The rest of the belligerent forces were subjected to demobilizations and were processed for granting of benefits for services rendered during the war. The Philippines and the US government established their veterans entities that would process recognition of the men and women in accordance with the policies and criteria established by the respective governments. Veterans were classified into recognized and deserving. The US government was fast enough to craft recognition policy that effectively denied many, even those who have actually served. This will be explained in details later. The 5-point recognition policy. This was implemented to screen guerrilla units of 1,300,000 applications for recognition. This was screened by the Guerrilla Affairs Branch, and the compilation of previous policies were dated back to 1943 with additions to cope with the previously unmet situations. There were two types of guerrillas for recognition, and this is unit and individual. For individual, there was the casualty and non-casualty. On the 5-point recognition policy, this was formulated by General MacArthur in Brisbane, Australia. There were 5 of these. The first is the maintenance of a unit in the field and in such a manner as to have contributed materially to the defeat of the enemy. Second is the establishment of a definite organization with ranks comparable to a PA or US Army table of organization, with no guerrillas to be recognized in the rank of a general, and the maintenance of adequate records. Third is the adequate control maintained by the unit commander. The sphere of operations and unit strength to be commensurate with terrain and situation. And the fourth is the continuity of activity since formation. The last is the full-time efforts on the part of the members. On the first policy, we see the problem for a small guerrilla unit in a remote town or barangay that cannot categorically state that it has materially contributed to the defeat of the enemy, considering that the number of units in the Japanese units in the country were not known and at that time, and nobody could judge whether a unit has materially contributed to the defeat of even a larger enemy unit in the area. The second is many of the fighters were unschooled, both for the leaders and the ordinary fighters. And we may not be able to know, they may not be able to know how an American or a Filipino military organization looked like. And under the policy of General MacArthur, anybody can readily fail in this category. The third is the aspect of control, and for the hundreds of small units, how will they ever determine that a certain unit has a commensurate force to fight an enemy using both the terrain and the situation of the enemy, since these were not known even before the war. The fourth is continuity. We must understand that sometime in 1942, there was a sauna operations conducted by the Japanese in order to flush and neutralize irregular units or guerrillas. And these were conducted in practically all parts of the country, leading to some guerrilla units going on Lilo status. And the US Army immediately suspected that going on a Lilo status might lead members into the issue of collaboration. And full-time effort on the part of the members. And we must also remember that these are fighters who are peasants. Some are fishermen. Some were working, tilling the fields in order to feed their families. And of course, they cannot sustain this by being in the hinterlands most of the time. And since the recognition policy, there are disqualifications, additional disqualifications. First is the dispersal of personnel to other units, preying upon civilian population, unwarranted attacks upon other guerrilla units, or dissolution under pressure and failure to reorganize and part-time activities. Failure on the part of on one of the policies lead a unit or a guerrilla individual into possible disqualification for recognition. And apart from the foregoing policy, they added a category that effectively denied recognition for other guerrilla members. Only 3 categories were recognized under U.S. terms. The rest were to be recognized by the Philippine government. Under the guerrilla affairs section of the USAFE, they have expanded the recognition only to, number 1, the combat units or individuals. Second is sabotage and demolition, and third is intelligence. The 4th category that were not recognized by the US were eventually recognized by the Philippine government because of the thing that they really fought during the war. These are necessary activities and jobs in the guerrilla units, and without it, the first 3 categories will not prosper. So that's the first category. That's the 4th category, which include volunteer guards, home guards, women auxiliary service, men auxiliary service, area wardens, polo units, spearmen units, blade weapons, and first aiders or medical units. So without these people, the fighters, the first 3 categories, would not really be able to do their job in fighting the enemies. Statistics on the processing of applications. There were perhaps more who were not able to register or show up for processing due to the difficulties in communications. Radio stations and newspaper could not be able to reach the remote locations of the country at that time. And for this, there was an initial 1,167,190 were subjected to investigation. The recognized guerrilla fighters were 237,529. Some 233,864 asked for reconsideration. But only 212,749 were reconsidered, but still not accepted. The total requested reconsideration totaled to 446,613. On the Japanese ground forces in the Philippines from 18 October 1944, on the eve of the return of General MacArthur, until the end of the war, while there are a great number of people who find the number of Filipino guerrillas to be seemingly unbelievable, it was also quite unbelievable that the Japanese High Command have deployed an equally outstanding number of troops prior to the return of the liberation forces. Reports obtained indicate that a total of 529,802 soldiers were stationed to confront the guerrillas and later the liberation forces, to keep the strategically important outpost in the Pacific as a shield to their homeland. The Public Law 79-301, otherwise known as Rescission Act of 1946. This was passed on 18 February of 1946, which effectively stripped Filipinos inducted into the USFA and the new Philippine Scouts Division of their recognition as U.S. veterans. Of the 66 countries that served with the U.S. during World War II, this was done only in the case of the Philippines, even considering that the Philippines was a colony of the U.S. at that time. The Rescission Act of 1946 was a bill introduced by Democrats headed by Carl Hayden and Richard Russell Jr. The Democrats then controlled 60 of the 96 seats in Senate and 318 of the 435 seats in Congress. The passage of the law in early 1946 only meant that even before the return of the American Liberation Forces, the die was cast of the betrayal. The bill really takes time before it is enacted, at least a year. And what was considered to be the problem was they thought that they will be shouldering an estimated $1 billion to be expended for the veterans' benefits over a period of 100 years. The Philippine Veterans Affairs Office and its mandate. Created before the Second World War, the PVAO predecessors served the veterans of the Philippine Revolution and the Filipino-American War to repay them for their selfless sacrifices rendered to win our independence from the colonizers. For several decades, the agency have been rendering services to honor and perpetuate the memory of the veterans as inspiration to the future and current generations for their sacrifices. It aims also to prepare the youth for their future role as defenders of this country from foreign invaders. The Philippine Veterans Affairs Office give pensions and non-pension benefits to the veterans in the form of pension, form of old age pension, death benefit, disability benefit, and total administrative disability. Non-pension are burial assistance for the veterans and the widow, educational benefits for their children or grandchildren, and hospitalization benefits for the veterans and the widow. For old age pension, we have a monthly 20,000 pesos for World War II, Vietnam War, and Korean War veterans, and 5,000 per month for post-war veterans. For AFP retirees, to be eligible, they must have attained the age of 65 years old. And in the case of death of the veteran, the surviving spouse will be paid the same benefit for the post-war veteran. There are also disability pensions, as shown. For burial assistance, we have 20,000 pesos to be given to the next of kin, and also an interment plug. And educational benefits, the children or grandchildren of World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, and Vietnam War veterans can enjoy educational benefit with an amount of 36,000 per annum for the matriculation of the children. For hospitalization benefits, the amounts and eligibility are as shown. Shown are the different shrines developed to honor the services of the veterans. There are 10 national military shrines all over the country. Also, the Veterans Memorial and Historical Preservation Program conducts the publication of books to document the contribution of our veterans for the preservation of and the winning of our freedom and independence. We also conduct commemoration of veteran-related activities. The more of this is the Araw ng Kagitingan and Philippine Veterans Week. Philippine Veterans Week starts with a sunrise and wreath-laying ceremony on the 5th of April of each year at the libingan ng mga bayani. Wreath-laying is held at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The activity is headed by the commanding general of the Philippine Army for the sunrise ceremony, and for the wreath-laying ceremony, the Secretary of National Defense lay wreath to the tomb of the unknown soldier. This is briefly followed at 10 o'clock by a review in honor of the veterans at the Hunters ROTC Guerrilla Field at the headquarters Philippine Army. This will be followed by the awarding of World War II veterans of their delayed recognition and medals that should have been given at the end of the war. On the 7th of April of each year, a tribute to all Filipino heroes is held at Corregidor Island. And on the 9th of April each year is the Araw ng Kagitingan, where the President of the Philippines is the guest of honor and speaker, with the ambassadors of the US and Japan joining him to honor all our heroes who fought during the war. This is followed by pagbunita sa Kapas at the Kapas National Shrine on April 10 of each year. And on the 11th of April is the sunset ceremony at the libingan ng mga bayani, where veterans will also be honored for their services. This will be capped by a lighting of candles at the tomb of the unknown soldier. On honoring our veterans, the U.S. U.S. government, U.S. Congress has authorized the awarding of the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal to all Filipino veterans of World War II. We conducted 14 awarding from 2018 up to 2020, and there were 444 World War II awardees, both living and deceased. And for those posthumous awards, their next of kin or survivors or descendants receive the awards on behalf of the veteran. On public affairs, PVAO publishes a quarterly publication called PVAO Bulletin, giving information on current and ongoing activities and projects of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office. With this, let me close with a simple challenge for all of us in this generation that it is our duty as Filipinos to honor our heroes. Magandang araw sa ating lahat.
Thank you very much, Executive Director Aguilar. Now, for all our resource speakers, you may now turn on your camera.
We now open the floor for the questions from the audience and the public. For our Facebook viewers, please place your questions on the comment section. And for the Zoom participants, please place your questions on our chat box. Please indicate as well to whom you would like to address your question. Okay, I believe we have our first question.
Yes. Okay. Number one.
Okay, for number one, this is addressed to any of our speakers. Were there women who joined the guerrilla forces, and what unique means did they employ in fighting? This is from Ferdinand Pagao of Schools Division of Taguig and Pateros, originally for Dr. Deviana, but anyone can please answer.
Well, if I might make it an initial answer, I am sure Resti has his own answer, and Ompoy also. We all have our answers. Women played a very active role in the resistance movement. In fact, some of them were guerrilla leaders. Just one classic example would be Yay Panlilio, who was in effect the brains behind the Markings guerrillas. You had women guerrillas in Leyte. I forgot that school teacher, the one who's pictured showing an American how she fought the Japanese. We had a Hook woman leader also. We had Hook women leaders as well. Commander Liwayway was one of the most famous ones, who was really very well known for dressing up or actually putting makeup and everything, lipstick just before a battle. So that's how composed she was before fighting. Many of them were in the intelligence section. In fact, they were accumulating intelligence material and giving it to the other guerrilla units. But we do have others who were out fighting in the forefront. There were others who were heroic also by not deserting their husbands. I know one defender of Bataan who joined the guerrillas in the Baguio area. He got married there, and he and his wife stayed together during the whole guerrilla campaign. So there are many. Some of them have been recognized. I think even more have not been recognized. But women did play very important roles, fighting, caring for the guerrillas, showing their clothes, cooking their food, and all of this, serving as messengers, serving as agents. The women's role, considering that this is Women's Month, I think is something that is very important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jose. Okay, now moving on to our second question. It is for Vivian Aguilar. Did the Hukbalahap guerrillas receive veterans recognition after the war? Did the Hukbalahap guerrillas receive veterans recognition after the war? For Sir Resty.
Yes, it was during the time of President Marcos, sometime in the 1970s, when they were recognized, and even up to this time, veterans of Hukbalahap are still receiving pension from the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office. I do not have exact figures as of this time, but at the time I left the agency, we still have a substantial number of Hukbalahap veterans who were receiving pension from PVAO.
There was one unit recognized by the Americans also, hindi ba, Resty? Ano ba? There was one unit recognized by the Americans actually.
It's in southern Luzon. Those who participated in the liberation of Los Baños. That was particularly recognized by the Americans even right after the war.
Right.
The other recognition came from the Philippine government already sometime, I think, late 60s or early 70s.
Right.
Okay, so now I believe this question is for Dr. Gonzalez. How did the pre-war military organization of the 6th Military District contribute to its success during the occupation wherein the guerrilla resistance in Panay was strong? Okay, this is about the pre-war military organization of the 6th Military District regarding the occupation wherein the guerrilla resistance in Panay was strong. Dr. Gonzalez?
Thank you for that question, sir. So my opinion of it is that the strength of the 6th Military District, when you get to the invasion, the actual occupation, the strength of the 6th Military District was largely dependent on how well it was organized before the start of the war. So the idea is that Manila was invaded first, so Luzon was invaded first, and then because we are an archipelago, you had this breathing space for the 6MD. So in that sense, they're the most organized guerrilla unit. But the reason why they're very organized is because they're on a separate island. And so when the war finally gets to them, they had a little bit more time to prepare. So the preparations that they made at the start of the war, before the war even started, was really critical to how efficient they were as a unit. I hope that answers the question, sir.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. That answers the question very clearly. And now,
For the next question, what could have been the motivation of some high-profile Filipinos, Aguinaldo, Recto, Aquino Sr., and Ricarte, in collaborating with the Japanese? What could have been the motivation of some high-profile Filipinos, namely Aguinaldo, Recto, Aquino Sr., or Ricarte, in collaborating with the Japanese? It is supposedly for Dr. Deviana, but anyone can answer too.
Well, I can answer it. I knew the families of some, and in the case of Laurel particularly, he has been labeled as a collaborator. I do not believe he was a collaborator, nor was he a puppet. He did stand up many times against the Japanese, even as president of the Republic. Now, why did they choose to side with the Japanese? The standard version is that before MacArthur and Quezon left Manila for Corregidor, the last minute instructions to them were that they should continue in office without taking an oath of allegiance to Japan, and that they should do everything in their power to soften the blow from the Japanese occupation. I think this was a reflection of the fact that the US was unable to defend the Philippines, and therefore loyalties would shift. In some cases, I don't want to name specific names. Some cases they would take advantage of the changed situation and become what would you say? They were opportunistic. There were some who were opportunistic who took advantage of the new administration and sought to put themselves in higher position. But I think the mainstream group, that is Recto and Laurel, and you would have even who were the other pre-war politicians who stayed on. Some of them had actually contacts with the guerrillas. So while they were supposed to travel around the Philippines to Negros or to Pangasinan, they were actually also indirectly contributing to the guerrillas wherever they went. I think Yulo, for example, when he went to Negros, he was actually contributing some money to the guerrillas in Negros as well. So it's not a cut and dry thing, you know? And it depends on who you're talking about. Some were very, very vocal. Even before Bataan fell, they were already out there urging Bataan to surrender. Others were more restrained. Others really highlighted more patriotism rather than pro-Japanese sentiments.
For the part of Iloilo po, I could probably share the example of Fermin Karam. So, you know, someone eventually has to sit in and kind of like grab hold of things and have some semblance of order. Essentially, what you have in Iloilo are like three separate circles with their own different stories, and there's this fog of war, which you know, it hinders their way of understanding each of these other circles. So very easily for the group of Peralta or Confessor, you know, Karam would have been some kind of villain, would have been perceived as a traitor. But then you get the other side of the story, you know, the one that is the story that is in the city. And you realize that Karam was really doing something like, you know, what Sirico said earlier about softening the blow. There has to be someone who has to sit in and perform the task of governing. And he took it, and that was a challenge. It was a very difficult position to find yourself in, and he took it. So in that sense, you know, he kind of made the best of the situation in which he couldn't avoid, but his heart was always with the Ilonggos, the Filipinos.
On the case of General Ricarte, he's really anti-American.
Yeah.
So he, when he was a revolutionary leader, he made several attempts to come back to the Philippines. He was already in, I think, in Guam,
Yeah.
but he tried to return to the Philippines and again launch another revolution against the Americans. And many times, many of his attempts, he has been captured by the Americans and again sent on exile. Then eventually, he decided to live permanently in Japan. And when the Japanese came, they made use of him as a propaganda material. So knowing that he is an anti-American, they made maximum use of General Ricarte. But more on the aspect of his being pro-Filipino and anti-American. So the collaboration issue should not apply too much on his case because of his personal conviction, really, that is pro-Filipino. Thank you.
Okay, in relation to the previous question regarding high-profile Filipinos who were linked to the Japanese, were there perhaps any cases of guerrilla units who denied recognition due to their political affiliation, perhaps those who remained underground, or other cases who just plainly denied recognition even after the war? to anyone?
I have stated in my lecture the 5 points recognition policy formulated by the Americans. The Americans asked the Filipinos to submit their records about their unit. That includes their history, their battle after battle reports, their rosters or list of members, and these were voluntarily submitted to the Americans. These were evaluated by the Americans, and eventually, based on the recognition policy that was formulated in Australia by General MacArthur, they were able to recognize some and did not recognize a lot of them. And these documents were eventually brought to the U.S. National Archives, and these documents were eventually brought back to the Philippines through our researchers at PVAO. We sent 2 teams to recover these documents that were taken by the Americans for purposes of recognition. So it is now in the hands of PVAO. These were scanned in the U.S. National Archives, and these were processed, and it's now available on the website of PVAO. The first batch is already available. The next batch, which was taken sometime in 2017, have been processed already and in the process of being uploaded in the future. So these are the major documents that were recovered from the Filipino units that became a basis for their recognition. So these are the major important documents leading to qualification or disqualification of units and individuals.
If I may siguro add, no, I'd like to share lang an interaction I had with Colonel Echanova, who wrote the Ode to the Unknown Soldier at the Balantang Shrine. So one day he was watching the news about recognition and something like veterans pension, right? And they used to receive just 5,000 pesos, which he was very proud to get. And he was very happy with 5,000 pesos, which to me, when I was in college, I thought 5,000 pesos wouldn't get you very far. But the way that he said it was that this is from the Philippine government. And he goes like, where else would you be able to get 5,000 pesos a month? And so he was really happy and proud of that 5,000 pesos. But he commented on how the other guerrillas, not necessarily in 6MD, but he was commenting on how they were fussing over getting recognition from the United States. And I said, why shouldn't you? I mean, it's due you, so why shouldn't you? And he goes, I didn't fight for the money. I mean, I'm not a mercenary. I never fought for the money. So, well, that was an individual case, but I don't know if that counts to answer the question.
Well, in connection with that, I might also add that the former national commander of the Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, Colonel Rafael Estrada, he used to be so proud of the fact that we fought for the Philippines. He would always tell me that and said, recognition, that's not very important. To the poorer people, yes, because that's where they would get their pensions. But I think the stand of people like Colonel Estrada was, we fought for the Philippines, so why do we have to work for American recognition? As long as the Philippine government recognizes us, that's enough. Or even the knowledge that they fought for the Philippines. That I also met a number of veterans who just said, we didn't even file our application for recognition because we knew we did what we had to do.
Okay, that's very interesting to see very different perspectives from definitely very different places also in the Philippines regarding guerrilla forces.
Next.
So I believe we have our next question.
Yes? Okay. So now we have our next question for Sir Deviana. He's now already on the Zoom. You can now turn on your camera, sir. This question is for you. In your opinion, could the Yusafe forces broke through the Japanese defenses during the lull of February to March 1942?
As you see, okay, sorry.
In your opinion, could the Yusafe forces broke through the Japanese defenses from February to March 1942?
As you see, if you're looking at the map, there's a gap, and that gap is in the spine of the province of Bataan. And if you could see the defenses, it is not actually defended. So you're using the mountain as a natural redoubt. And for a defender, it would be hard to defend also. And for a determined infiltrator, you can pass through the jungle. And many of the Japanese were already veterans of China. And some may have fought in a forested area. So therefore, it would be easy for them to pass through the mountainous center of Bataan. And thus, when they broke through, they went past through the defenses in what they call the Abukay Hermosa line, because that center, which is actually mountainous and forested, is quite hard to defend. Even today, I've been to that area, and I see, this is how an area that could be easily infiltrated, and you cannot just build defenses there. And I would, and again, I'm talking about hindsight. So when Bataan was chosen as one of the areas where USAPE forces would escape in case of an invasion, they should have fortified the area, just like the Japanese did when the Americans were advancing towards them. So the mountains, they dug tunnels and they dug foxholes. So what we have is quite haphazard defense, sad to say. Thank you.
Okay, sir. Okay,
Well,
thank you.
if I might add to that, no, the lull period took place after the Abukay line fell. Lull period took place when the Pilar Bagak line was already in place, and there was no gap between that. In fact, Mount Samat, as you pointed out, was in the center of that, so it was a very strategically defensive position. So compared to the Abukay line, the Pilar Bagak line was very well defended. The Japanese could not break through. The question there really is, could we have broken out? Because there was that more than 1 month lull that took place in February, March 1942. This is where Filipinos were getting sick. Filipinos were very hungry. There was not enough food. And General Lim in particular proposed that they break out because they knew at that time, intelligence reports already showed that the Japanese had pulled back. There was only the 16th Division and the 65th Brigade that were there. Neither of them were up to strength at that time. And General Lim realized it was a futile thing to just wait for American aid that might not come. So he suggested that they break out, defeat whatever Japanese forces were in front of them, and move into the Zambales Mountains and elsewhere to begin guerrilla operations. So Lim had that plan actually, and he did suggest it. It was turned down because MacArthur was still around, and MacArthur's idea was he had been led to believe by Washington that the reinforcements were coming. It's only when he reached Australia that he found out there were no reinforcements at all. So that plan was not favorably received. Now, had it been approved and had the USAFE broken through the Japanese lines and gotten out of Bataan, maybe they could have continued on with the guerrilla operations a little longer. In fact, some guerrillas were already being formed by that time. But again, the fact that it would have delayed, maybe conventional resistance would have ended probably sooner, but you would have had an unconventional war starting earlier.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jose. We have another comment from Zoom that takes a rather controversial stance, and it asks our speakers, what is your take on the comment that there's no point in celebrating the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, considering that it's a battle we lost? Because not a few lament that we are the only people on earth that commemorate defeat instead of victory. So, if any other comment regarding this comment, can you please elaborate your answers?
Though it was already answered through chat room, you can add
Yes.
up your answers now.
Sige. Well, yeah, Resty and Ompoy and I commented on that in the chat box also. But it also says that we're the only people who commemorate defeats. No, there are other people who also commemorate defeats and they learn from it. Yeah. The fact that it's a defeat does not mean that there's no glory in it. There is the Alamo in the United States. The Australians commemorate as Anzac Day their defeat in Turkey when the British really poorly advised had them land in Turkey. The Japanese remember August 15 every year. And it's not that they're ashamed of it. They knew that they were defeated, but something that should never be repeated again. Singapore observes February 15 as its national day. Now, so February 15 is when the British surrendered. Now, to them, that is the lesson that they should always be prepared. So the fact that this was a defeat does not necessarily mean it's not worth commemorating. In fact, prior to that, as I think Resty pointed out also, I mean, these were civilian Filipinos. They were reservists who fought much harder than the Japanese expected. And that's why the death march was, in a way, turned out that bad. But yes, even Bonifacio, the Katipunan, their attack on San Juan, the Polvorin, we commemorate that. It was a tactical defeat, but it showed Kagitingan at its highest level.
Siguro po, for the benefit of those who wouldn't be able to see the chat, I would like to maybe reiterate the idea that it should be seen as part of a larger narrative. That larger narrative, Bale, celebrates the victory of Filipinos rather than the defeat, but it starts off with the defeat. The other one is that, of course, you shouldn't see it as a defeat because deeply embedded within the narrative, within the history of the defeat, are stories of Kagitingan. And siguro, if you were to try and analyze the different national narratives or maybe nationalist narratives, the saying that we learn more from our defeats than our victories. So if you apply that to nationalist narratives, the most passionate stories, Bale, the ones that whip up national sentiment, are those of defeat rather than of victories.
In the particular case of the Israelis, they have Masada. And every time that they recruit a soldier, all of the new recruits go to Masada and swear that Masada will never fall again. So in our case, it would be unfair for us not to remember our veterans. So fought hard in Bataan and Corregidor, just because the Americans were the ones who decided on surrendering the forces. And this came at a time when, if we see the larger picture, really Bataan and the Philippines was sacrificed in order to maintain the alliance, the Anglo-American alliance. They have to sacrifice the Philippines because the Australian forces are being utilized by the Allies in North Africa. Actually, there were 3 divisions in North Africa and 1 in Malaya. These units were out of the country at the time when the Second World War was raging. So it would be very easy for the Japanese to immediately proceed to Australia because there were no forces in Australia. So the reason why MacArthur was pulled out from Bataan was for him to establish a joint, a combined defense of Australia using American forces initially, while the Australians are fighting in North Africa. By the time that they could have ensured a victory in North Africa, the Australian forces can already return to Australia and continue the fight in their homeland. So really, these were based on a book which I read. And from the tactical and operational viewpoint, we could say that Bataan and Corregidor were tactical defeats. But on the strategic level, on the alliance, on the part of the Allies, it was a strategic victory. So we should not consider only the tactical aspect of the fighting. We should also, aside from the fact that our veterans deserve to be recognized for the effort they have done, considering that they were half-baked at the time. They were facing a veteran units from Japan who had experiences in mainland Asia, while they were only trained for 6 months, and some of the volunteers never had experience in military affairs. Their officers were training them while the Japanese were not looking. While the Japanese were not attacking them, they were training the volunteers into soldiery, the aspect of soldiery. Thank you.
Thank you for all the collaborative responses from all of our speakers. Welcome to our Q&A session. Undersecretary Ernesto G. Carolina and BMHD Chief Jericho Amagna. Now moving on to our next question, anyone can answer this one. What is the importance of national military shrines and battle sites or monuments in developing our nationalism? What is the importance of national military shrines and battle sites or monuments in developing our nationalism?
Is it okay for me to start, sir?
Sige.
Right. So I think it was Benedict Anderson who wrote that the most potent. You see, in nation, it's a cultural construct, right? It's all it's something that is imagined, you know. So being something that is imagined into being, it needs potency. How do you convince people that they're part of something? So Benedict Anderson, I think, wrote about how the cenotaph was the most powerful of all the elements that could move people to celebrating the nation. And I think that is where the shrines actually fit in. If you consider, when I first approached the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, I was around about the same age as the soldier would have been when he first entered into service. And this was a soldier in front of me who didn't have a name. He's not lost to history, but he's lost to memory. And so the whole idea about sacrificing your life for the sake of the nation is encapsulated by that sacrifice of this unknown soldier. You don't know who this person is, in the same way that you don't know, everyone in, say, Mindanao, Visayas, or Luzon. You don't get to meet these people, but you all share this kind of like common cultural link, which you're all part of the nation. And in that sense, that's for me. That's where the shrines kind of like work.
May I add that the shrines are a tangible evidence that these things really happened, especially when the shrine is located at the exact site. And the Military Shrine Service of PVAO is doing a great job in maintaining the historical sites. As well, and again, also we have also to emphasize the role of the museums. These are tangible evidences of historical events, as well as the personalities behind those events, and they are real people, and they could serve as inspiration. Imagine if you just go to Bataan, and you can put yourselves in the shoes of those who were fighting, especially right now. It's a month of April. The sun is very hot, and try imagine yourself walking the death march from, let's say, from Maribeles to San Fernando, and you were wounded, tired, um, lacking food and water, and you can see the sacrifices of our veterans, and they really offer their lives for their country. So, and you can see why would they do that? Because of love of country, and that would be an inspiration for all. Thank you.
The military shrines are icons of history. When all the people that figured in a certain event are all gone, what remains are the symbols, the place where the event happened. So in this particular case, these icons are established in places just like here in Mount Samat, where people remember the sacrifices of their forebears. We must remember that in a country with a population of 18 million, there were about 1 million who died, who were killed during the war, and also about 500,000 or more were those who fought during the war. And how could we memorialize the efforts of these individuals and groups that resisted the enemy is best symbolized by these national military shrines.
Yeah. If I might add also that the location of the military shrines is to me very meaningful, especially to me Mount Samat. The first time I went up to Mount Samat, which was very long ago, I really had my hair standing on end because I thought this is where all these young people fought, and many of them died. I think the one thing that we failed to realize is that so many of those who fought in the war were really young. Aside from that being 1 million out of 18 million population, I think the majority of those who fought were really quite young. They were teenagers. They were in the early 20s. One thing that made Bataan, that's why Mount Samat to me is very significant, is because in the forces that defended Bataan, these were not just from Luzon. They were from all over Luzon, all the way from Bicol to Ilocos, Cagayan, all over Luzon, but they also had elements from the Visayas, from Negros, from Leyte, Samar, and other places. And so when Bataan fell, the whole country felt it. It was not a Luzon thing. It was not a Bataan thing. It was the whole nation. And the other military shrines are especially important because they represent other events. The one in Capas is the suffering of the prisoners of war, and yet how they were able to survive that. The Balantang Cemetery is very important, I think, because it's a guerrilla move. It's a guerrilla resistance movement, and it's there where the fighting took place. The same is true with Balete Pass. That's also where a major battle took place. So these are mainly located. I think the one in La Union also, Camp Spencer is also military shrines. So these show that how widespread the Kagitingan was. It was not limited to Luzon. It was not limited to one province. It was really all over. I think we should, maybe one more thing we can do is locate a shrine in Mindanao, then make that, build up on that. So at least we have Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. But I agree, very tangible evidence of what our forebears did during earlier times.
Itong screen.
Hi,
Right, General.
MC.
Yeah.
Yes,
I'd like to add some. Yeah.
have to say something. Go ahead, po.
I'd like to add some briefly something on what the speakers shared. MC, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah. Okay. I like that question because we have to answer that every year when we face Congress asking for funds to maintain these shrines. You know, we have about 9 national military shrines being maintained, and apart from that, there are other historical sites where we should have a shrine, but we don't. So we have in our program not only the maintenance of existing shrines, but the establishment, the creation of new shrines, and to articulate and defend the budget, we have given a name to these shrines. We call it Kagitingan Builders, Love for Country Builders. Of course, I appreciate that Dr. Gonzalez defined this morning what Kagitingan means. And we have correlated these shrines with these are the places where we bring our young people, our citizens, so that they will know their history, they will know their country. And we always say that even a person, it's very hard to love a person if you do not know him. So, and this is where also you imbibe a sense of national pride. And all of this put together, this builds what we call love for country. So, in our defense of the budget, because a very small percentage of our budget goes to what we call love for country builders. If you look at the budget of PVAO, 98% of that goes to pension and benefits. Less than 2% goes to this love for country building. And so to be able to get more funds so that we can embark on not only building but upgrading, because I can tell you, and I think Dr. Jose knows this because he has traveled abroad, none of our war memorials or battle monuments here can compare to those that we find in other places, not in Europe or in US. Dito na lang, even here in Asia or Southeast Asia. So what we have done in the last few years is to relate this with the Build program. In other words, we have articulated to Congress that our Build program should not be fixated on physical infrastructure. Investment on this, on the future, should not be about bridges, dams, IT, and the like, only roads, highways. But just like other countries, we should invest also on this the software, the soft infrastructure that builds Kagitingan and love for country, especially among our young people. So we have correlated this these shrines, this love, these Kagitingan builders to preparing our future defenders, our future veterans.
Wow, that gives us a better understanding and appreciation of our monuments and shrines. Huh?
Mhm.
Okay, so for our next question, were there any instances of racial discrimination among American and Filipino soldiers in Bataan and Corregidor? So, any racial discrimination instances, perhaps? Anyone can answer, please.
Yeah, I mean, from what I know, there were cases of discrimination both in Bataan and Corregidor. Sometimes it was really failure to understand. The Americans didn't understand the Filipinos. Sometimes it was also how far one was from the rear, so how far front one was, because generally the Filipinos were in the front line in Bataan, and therefore they were the farthest from the rear lines where the supplies were coming from. And along the way, the supplies would be taken by people who would intercept it. And well, the Americans were eating differently from the Filipinos. The Americans were more used to eating bread. They had canned goods. The Filipinos in the front line, especially if the supply did not reach them, simply had to survive on what little rice they had, or they even had to go in the front, no man's land, to get food. So there were cases of discrimination that occurred in both Bataan and Corregidor. I think some also, even in the guerrilla resistance movement, there were also cases when Americans commanded Filipinos. There were misunderstandings, and there were, yes, bluntly putting it, cases of racial discrimination.
In the case of, I read this in the book of the late Colonel Eliseo Rio, member of the First Regular Division. There were cases wherein an American officer bad-mouthed Filipino troops. They did not understand that most of our soldiers, some of them were volunteers, and they did not have prior military training before the war, and even had the conscripts had very little training, and this American officer expected the soldiers to be like an American regular troop. So, well, there was a documentation wherein an American really showed his discrimination over Filipino troops, even in the height of the fighting in Bataan.
To add to that, of course, even there are some Filipinos who are with the U.S. Army. They are Philippine Scouts. Philippine Scouts are not considered PA or Philippine Army, and they receive better pay, and they receive better gear, and they receive better rations. So that's a source of resentment among the PA people, the Philippine Army people. Again, even if you are Filipino, you are under U.S. command, and you receive better pay. and of course they were separated from the rest, and they consider the scouts as more veteran because they also fought in other areas of the Philippines, especially when there's a disturbance in Mindanao, and also agrarian conflicts. Again, as Philippine Scouts, they seem to have some bravado because they're one story that I heard from Corregidor, that they're better marksmen than the Americans. That the Japanese consider them more dangerous, and that's why they crushed their fingers when they surrendered. Um, so okay, and also when it came to supplies, Filipinos are left to forage. That's why we have what you call monkey meat. So uh, and they had to add to their meager supplies. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have another question directed to Dr. Ray Gonzalez. Did Peralta's guerrilla force capture some Makapili in Visayas region? This is a question from Facebook from Jose Carlo Ibabaw. So, did Peralta's guerrilla force capture some Makapili in Visayas region?
I have to say, I have to say I haven't encountered any information about capturing Makapili per se, but there are accounts about the things that they did to um, Japanese supporters, and half the time these supporters, it was just purely by a matter of coincidence. For instance, I was able to hear of a story of a case in Dumangas. So there were lawless elements at the start of the occupation, and no one wanted to be a policeman. I mean, practically the government collapsed, and so no one was getting any pay or anything like that. So one particular person saw the need for some kind of police force, and he eventually got that authorization, unfortunately from the Japanese, and so he was perceived as a supporter of the Japanese and a spy for the Japanese, and they burned him in the middle of the street. The guerrillas burned him in the middle of the street, and no one lifted a finger to help. So I have heard of that, but as to whether they were Makapili per se, I'm afraid I haven't encountered anything like that.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Gonzalez. For next question.
Is it true that these forces in Mount Samat was completely destroyed during the final offensive by the Japanese on April 3, 1942? Good Friday. Is it true that these forces in Mount Samat was completely destroyed during the final offensive by the Japanese on April 3, 1942?
Well, not completely destroyed because many of them survived, and I got to know quite a number of them. But they were pushed back. So the Japanese made a determined attempt to capture Mount Samat because whoever had that high ground had basically control over Bataan. So remember that the soldiers in the front line had been there for 3 months. They were on half rations or even more, less than half rations. Many of them did not have enough sleep. They were very tired. The Japanese were using fresh troops that came in from China. The 4th Division was really very fresh, very experienced, and they used tanks. We had no tanks in that part of Bataan at that time. So we had very little to fight the tanks with, and the Japanese just had so much artillery to destroy the front line. So they did not, they pulled back, but many of them still survived.
Okay, so for our last question, we have a question directed for General Aguilar. Are there instances that some guerrilla units are denied to discrepancies in their reports and narratives? For example, their reports were received and recognized, but at the same time denied of the discrepancies for veterans. Are there some cases like this, sir?
Well, there are plenty of cases wherein I'd like to emphasize that all of the recognition of individuals and units were all based on the criteria that the Americans crafted before the liberation period. So that's the reason why some units, small units, would like to get because there are plenty of small units that proliferated in the country during that time. That's why you could see that there were small units trying to convince another small unit to merge forces so that they could be classified within the parameters of the American recognition policy. Kaya naghahatakan ng units. Case in point is just like the Maharlika, they were trying to convince other small units to join them, and vice versa, the other units doing the same. So plenty of cases have been documented, and these were there are compilations of some sort of studies conducted by these U.S. Army units that were studying the classifications of units who fought during the war, and this can be found at the Veterans Memorial and Historical Division. I found this out when I was still assigned with PVAO, and we did not really care to look at it, but many of the cases were already summarized in the form of some sort of summaries, and these were bound in old forgotten folders, and this can be found in PVAO. I have seen it, and there are plenty of these in the custody of PVAO.
Okay, thank you, sir, for that. Apparently, we have one more question. This is from Zoom. What peculiar factor or factors contributed to the success of the guerrilla movement in Panay? Has it something to do with the place or the drive of the people? So specifically in the Panay area, what does the locale or the place have to do with the success of the guerrilla movement?
You can answer this one, sir. You can answer this one, Sir Ray Gonzalez or Sir.
Okay, ma'am. So my personal opinion is that geography played a very big factor. If Panay was the one that was hit first, probably without a doubt, it would also collapse. So just to share idea that the attack came several months later, gave them the time they needed to prepare, and even just the whole idea of from laying down mines, demolishing the bridges, delaying tactics, and also the idea of just being able to figure out what to do in the case of an actual defeat. How were they going to exfiltrate? So the longer they had, the longer time to prepare for it. And I think that was the greatest factor. The other one would be that I think in 1942, I think you have about 5,000 Japanese soldiers, and then you have like 15,000 6MD guerrillas. And the problem was that one was ill-equipped and the other one was outnumbered. So the numbers actually created a stalemate, and that would have been a factor as well, because the Japanese wouldn't want to press the attack. They wouldn't want to press the attack on Mount Baloy, for instance, because it was going to be some kind of Mount Samat as well. So those two things, but I also wouldn't discount just the sheer character of the 6NB. I wouldn't say there is something unique or specific about the Ilonggos. I mean, we have been stereotyped as being a very happy-go-lucky bunch of people who don't, we don't worry about tomorrow. We just worry about today. I wouldn't say that there really is some truth to that. But these people were faced with a challenge, and they saw it through. So I think that is the testament to their character. I hope that was able to answer the question, Ma'am Ludi.
Okay, there appears to be no more questions left. Seeing that we have no more questions, we would like to thank our speakers for joining us here today and participating in this Q&A. Seeing there are no more questions, we now end our open forum.
Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in our Q&A and for sending in your questions on our Facebook Live and here on Zoom. Thank you very much also to our speakers, Dr. Ricardo Fiose, Sir Ray Carlo Gonzalez, Dr. Resty Aguilar, Sir Augusto de Viana, also to our Undersecretary Ernesto G. Carolina for coming today. And as we now near the end of our program, let us have the Department of National Defense Secretary, Mr. Delphine and Lorenzana, for his closing remarks.
Undersecretary Nesty Carolina of the Philippine Veterans Affairs Office, Deputy Executive Director Alvin Alcid of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Administrator Francis Initorio of the Mount Samat Flagship Tourism Enterprise Zone of TIESA, Dr. Neil Santillan, Chair of the UP Department of History, other partners from the Philippine Veterans Bank and the Academe, resource speaker, participants, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant morning. The bravery of our World War II veterans is a testament of a soldier's ultimate sacrifice for a lasting future of peace and freedom. We owe much of what we enjoy today to soldiers who valiantly fought for the country. A great many of them did not survive to tell their stories. Hence, this Kagitingan webinar series, which will draw valuable historical lessons for the youth today, is truly a commendable endeavor. Since last year, the COVID-19 pandemic has made a lot of memorial activities impossible, such as actual interaction with World War II veterans in various national military shrines during the Philippine Veterans Week. This year, I am pleased that PVAO has partnered with the NHCP, TIESA, and the Philippine Veterans Bank to share the historical narratives of the war to a broader audience. This, I believe, is one of the best and most meaningful commemorative activities during this global health crisis. And I thank you all for making this possible. Through this Kagitingan webinar series, we can see for ourselves the larger-than-life heroism which our beloved World War II veterans embodied. As we admire and marvel in their greatness, I hope that we can connect with their legacy and find concrete actions we can do to continue their values, especially that of valor and of love of country. May the lessons presented here deepen your knowledge on history and lessons to awaken your patriotism. As a retired soldier, it means a lot to me that the youth values my service to the country. Our World War II veterans feel the same way too, and they deserve our highest respect and appreciation for their enduring legacy. In his poem, Pag-ibig sa Tinubuang Lupa, Gat Andres Bonifacio described a love for country which can endure even numerous deaths. It reads, "Walang alaala't inaasam-asam kundi ang makita'y lupang tinubuan. pati nang magdusat 10 kamatayan, waring masarap kung dahil sa bayan. As for today's youth, it's time to prove ourselves worthy of our veterans' noble legacy. Simple lang ang paraan. Sabi nga sa Panatang Makabayan, diringgin ko ang payo ng aking mga magulang, susundin ko ang mga tuntunin ng aking paaralan, tutuparin ko ang tungkulin ng isang mamamayang makabayan at masunurin sa batas. Paglilingkuran ko ang aking bayan ng walang pag-iimbot at ng buong katapatan, sa isip, salita at sa gawa. Maraming salamat at maligayang linggo ng veteranong Pilipino. Mabuhay kayong lahat!
Kindly accomplish the evaluation form. You will be receiving your e-certificate after a day. Kindly check your spam folder in case it was sent there instead of your inbox. And for the next episode of our Kagitingan webinar series, please direct yourself to the screen. We have Bayanihan, Kwentuhan ng Kabayanihan as part of the Kagitingan PVAO Historical Webinar Series. This happens in Zoom on 29th March 2021. This is from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. We have Nicolasa Dairit Panlilio, Assistant Professor Tondi Pepito G. Ramos II, Maria Orosa, Assistant Professor Francis Justin M. Malban, and Bay Haja Matabay Plang, with Assistant Professor Francisco Jaime Paulo A. Guiang.
So that concludes our Heroism and Valor Symposium for today. We thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And we hope to see you on the next one. I am Maggie Grace Sahagun.
And I am Nico Orero. We have been your hosts for today. Thank you and good afternoon.
Malilimutan, matitiyak.